What's up, guys? Today let's draw and paint a dragon. I'm going to put on my teacher hat. We're going to do a full step-by-step tutorial. We're going to go from a blank canvas through the drawing and design process all the way to a finished painting. And dragons are awesome, but they're also a really perfect teaching subject. Like, they really exemplify a lot of good principles of design and a lot of cool rendering tricks. So I think there's going to be a ton of value in this one. So hang out with me for a little bit, pick up a few new tricks, and watch a cool painting take shape. Let's dive in. The blank canvas, always the hardest part of any painting, right? So let's just get started. And I'm going to use my pencil brush and just do some initial sketchy explorations, trying to find a really pleasing action line. So basically sketching out some cool, dynamic, fluid, central line. The action line is super important. It's kind of that energy that flows through something, that gives it a sense of movement. And this exists in all kinds of things. A human figure drawing, a gesture drawing, a spaceship, or a gun. Anything that has a sense of forward movement and energy and flow. And dragons absolutely exemplify this. They're this nice sort of serpentine creature, so we can make them into this giant fluid S-curve. It's perfect. Another way that dragons are kind of the perfect teacher for a lot of these principles. This guy is basically this big S-curve. It gives him a lot of dynamism. It's like he's curled around this perch. It gives him a lot of potential energy, like he could just leap off and take flight at any moment. And that's really cool. That's exciting. It's like we're putting a little bit of story into this with even these very early sketchy decisions. So the action line, really important. Even though it's just some sketchy, basic, curvy lines, it ends up playing a really big role in the ultimate success of the piece. So something worth tinkering with, getting right, stretch things around, erase, redo. And from there, we can go into some more refined line art, which is what I'm doing now. I've got a base pose that I really like, that feels dynamic, feels like it tells a cool story, has that great action line. So now I'm starting to actually draw, like make this look like a dragon. And I'm keeping a few really key things in mind with that. The first one is the pose. We've sort of defined that with the early action line, but this is really important. I have him kind of with his head hung a little bit low. It's like he is hanging out over the perch. It gives him this sense of like lording over whatever is below, a valley or a village or wherever this guy exists. It's sort of that Batman on a rooftop looking out over Gotham sort of vibe. It elevates the dragon, makes him or her into something lofty, which is what we want. This creature is what I think of as a marvel, kind of the type of creature who we want to inspire awe. I usually think of creatures as like it's either a monster we want to hate, it's something cute that we want to attract people, or it's just something lofty. There are certainly other categories, but this is definitely that beautiful, regal-looking creature. And that's another design principle that I think dragons really teach well, is taking bits from real-world animals and infusing them into your designs. That's a critical skill for a concept artist, is finding those real-world influences and putting it into your design, taking it apart into its pieces and reassembling it into something that you can use. A dragon is many different animals. I think obviously on the surface level there's some lizard or dinosaur type stuff going on, right? They're scaly. They have little spikes and claws. So I guess most surface level, I'd say it's like iguana or something like that. That's sort of the real world dragon. You can go look at some scale or spiky tail references and you'll have a great starting point. But dragons are also other things. I would say there's a lot of horse in a dragon, especially in a movie where somebody rides it. It's like the dragon can be this trusty ally in a way that a horse is. They have this really strong sense of musculature and a curvy neck. They seem noble and wise somehow in a lot of ways that I think a horse also has. Oddly soulful, like it's easy for us to project human qualities into a dragon. As funny as that is, but it's super true. And then finally, human. Well, not finally, I could probably list like 10, but I am doing some really very human anatomy stuff with this dragon. His hands, his forearms, a lot of his neck musculature, a lot of how his face works is sort of like a human skull, the cheekbones kind of like sharpening down into a maxilla for his teeth. A lot of that is very human. And actually, the way we feel about the dragon depends a lot on how much lizard versus how much human and horse we tilt it towards. So for example, a dragon that we want to be scared of or hate, we would make it more lizard and alligator, make it more just crooked interlocking teeth, kind of obliterate a lot of the humanity or mammal from it. And then it becomes this thing that's sort of other. It seems more remorseless, less soulful. But I want this dragon to be possibly kind of likable, be sort of something relatable, something that we might make friends with. Maybe this dragon can talk, one of those things. All that kind of cool stuff. So I'm making a few design decisions to just ever so slightly humanize the dragon. And the arms are definitely a huge part of that, but the face, the jaws, the way the mouth works, all of those decisions play a huge role on how we're telling our viewer, I want you to like this dragon or hate this dragon. Another great thing that just teaches you design by drawing dragons, how to use real world animal references, how to steer what your viewer is going to feel about this thing that you're designing, just based on how human it is. Now, there is some animal and anatomy knowledge that I'm sort of doing in the background here. And actually, I'm not super sure about how I handled these wings, for example, because if we're being sticklers, not that dragons are real, but something like a bat, for example, for a wing. Its wing is actually just a hand that has sort of changed the proportions. Its fingers are those long parts that fill out the wing. A dragon theoretically should be similar, but I've taken some liberties here. I actually wanted that hand to look a little more human, like it's gripping the rock that he's sitting on. And that's just a design decision that I made. But I also, a good case could be made that we need this to match bat wing anatomy more closely. So all part of a concept artist's job is to make those decisions and then tinker with those things, iterate until something works for the project that you're working on. Pretty far along in our line art here, which is looking cool. I'm just refining, doing things like line weight hierarchy to try and make certain parts of the lines heavier. Want more attention and detail to be on the eye, for example. Anywhere that I want attention to go, I'm going to make the lines a little more bold, but also a little busier. Detail, visual activity always attracts attention. So wherever those things really want to play those up, I'll add a little bit more. Line weight can also do some really good things for the forms, right? Those bold lines around the arms really help define them from all those smaller lines around the wrinkles. So just a little fine tuning here to make this all work and to make sure I'm pleased, because we're basically almost at a finished design here. So it's sort of decisions I'm going to lock in. With digital art, nothing's ever really final, because even at the very last steps of this, I am going to be doing some changes. But for now, I like to feel like I have my design settled before I switch to painting mode. And we're about to do that. You may notice this is super similar to a dragon that I painted for a video last summer. And that's very much by design. I got a lot of requests for a full tutorial on that. Not just the philosophy that went along with that video, but a how-to. So for everybody who made that request, this is totally for you. And I also really like that dragon. Nice pose, a lot of design lessons to teach. So sort of like I'm revisiting an old friend here and really filling in a lot of those knowledge gaps that I left in the last video. Okay, we are doing our probably biggest mode switch of the entire process here. I'm switching from design mode to painting mode. I'm starting to think about value. So we really need to understand all of these forms that we are describing. Value, basically, if we're let's start with basics. We are trying to define all of these three-dimensional forms that make up this creature. It's a good thing to do to simplify this in your mind to start, at least. The dragon's head, its neck, is sort of a cylinder in its general form. So the side of the cylinder facing the light source will have higher values. The side of the head that I'm describing now that's facing up towards the light source, I am giving that higher value. So light towards the light source and fading away to shadow away. It can get significantly more complicated than that, but just in the most general terms, that is basically what we are trying to figure out right now. Now, my brush. This is a standard basic round brush. There is absolutely nothing special about this. I like to paint values with very low flow and opacity. So it looks like I'm jumping around between like 20%, 40% for both flow and opacity. And I'll go up and down on that, but I like to repeatedly tap to build up tones very slowly. So one tap will be a 20% opacity, and then again, 20% again. So that every time I go over a part of the creature again and again, it slowly builds up value. Now, very importantly, I'm only painting with one color. I'm sticking with this orange. If I want it to be dark, if I made something too bright, I'll erase. I will not paint with a different color. That will cause issues later in my process if you do that. So if you are doing this exactly, make sure you stick with just one color like I am doing. Now, a question I get often is, what's up with that orange? Why orange? If you have painted with me before, you know that I pretty much always use this orange. And the answer is, I'm not really sure why I started doing it that way. It's basically completely arbitrary. I just kind of like it. It's a cool color. It pops well against this dark cyan base that I always like to start with as my design silhouette. And it's just something that I started doing like a decade ago, and it just kind of stuck. If you are following along with me, you do not have to choose this particular orange. Paint with a light gray. Paint with nuclear yellow. It really doesn't matter, because we're actually going to shift and turn this into a color painting later in the process. Kind of arbitrary, but it's just something that works for me, and it's kind of cool, so I like it. Moving from head and neck into other parts of the creature, and hopefully you're getting a sense for how I slowly build up values. My brush is usually set on quasi-soft, maybe like 50% hardness in Photoshop brush settings, but what I love about the round brush is you can change that dynamically. You can actually use the bracket keys while holding down Shift to adjust your brush softness as you go. Insanely powerful and lets you very quickly change things, because the next most important point about value, after form, so just that whole light value to show planes facing the light source, less value, darker value away. That's super important. That will give you that round, spherical, three-dimensional form look. The other very important and actually most often overlooked thing about value that I notice with the artists who I work with is control of your value edges. That is always such a cool, exciting, like unlocking a higher level of mastery when an artist can really nail this. So, edges. We have basically two kinds of edges, soft edges and hard edges. Soft edges are gradients. They're kind of slow, gradual fades from light to dark. So think of a sphere, or looking at the shoulder muscle of this dragon. It's a pretty gentle arc from light value slowly in an even gradient moving over to shadow. Now that's really important. That makes things look round. But what we also need is sharp, hard edges, places where value jumps from dark to light really abruptly. And that's happening in a lot of different places too. And that is a key to making values look organic. That's how I'm making all of these suggestions of muscles. It makes things look like tendons and anatomy under the skin, just because of very careful control over value edges. Think of planes. Think of like tracing a line over the surface of this dragon's forearm, for example. There would be places where it's a nice even hill, like you're driving a car over a hill, but then there are these sudden abrupt changes, maybe where two muscles kind of meet up together, where two hills meet, two little spheres kind of smash together. Where that happens, we need these really sharp changes from dark to light. It's like we are cutting a line defining two forms. If you can master that, if you can make those hard cuts from light to dark, it suddenly just makes musculature and anatomy look instantly more realistic. I've practiced and studied anatomy a lot in my career, but if you can master value edge control, you can get away with quite a lot of uncertainty. For example, I'm not entirely sure that those little muscles around the dragon's elbow are exactly right. I think I might have added one too many. But it's sort of like, I don't care, because value edge control makes it look plausible. It feels real. This looks like a believable, organic being, because we see those muscles. It's one of those nice design things where we anchor something and ground it in a real world model, and that makes it seem more believable. We buy this as a breathing, living creature because, oh wow, it has believable looking muscles. It has scales like some animal that I've seen. It's all part of grounding something and showing your viewers something familiar that they recognize, which then gives you permission to kind of push it, right? It's that 80-20 rule in design where we want things to be 80% familiar, grounded in reality, but then a little something extra, 20% more. Kind of, that's the space we get to play with as designers. That's where we get to build some world that doesn't really exist in that 20%. But we have to do the 80%. We have to make it familiar and believable and plausible so that your viewer will accept it. You kind of have to get them to buy in and believe what they're seeing. Otherwise, all of the cool things that you have invented, your design choices, sort of get dismissed. So tricky, but really important. And finding that balance is a huge part of a concept artist's skill set. I usually get kind of tired at this point and need a break. I find like feet, for example, on a figure painting, by the time I work my way from the head and face all the way down, I usually find I'm rushing through the feet. So the tail, the feet on this dragon, I'm pretty sure I stepped away and ate lunch or something before I came back to finish it, because we never want something to just suck at some part of our painting because we were tired, because we kind of ran out of artistic battery. So take breaks. Come back to these things, especially when you start getting near the end of a part of a phase. Make sure you have plenty energy left in the tank. Refining a little bit. And at this point in the process, I usually have to go back and wash over things. Still just painting with low flow and opacity, but I've been busy defining forms so much that it can actually start looking too visually active. It can look like a million little zebra stripes of light and dark happening. So I go back and wash over to unify things a bit. Okay, next step. As you can see, I just changed the hue and saturation on that orange value layer after making a copy just in case. And I have switched it to this off-white. Now I've created a layer under it to add some reds to the wings to give it a little bit of hue variation, but now we're starting to paint directly with color. I'm defining shadows and highlights. I'm adding in some hard edges to show like where the shoulder is blocking out light, for example. I'm doing a little more value unification, so kind of washing things together a little bit so that things don't look quite so visually active like we have light, dark, a million times. But I'm thinking about the big picture forms. I'm unifying things. I'm bringing them together. I want the whole back, the whole like dorsal side of this creature to feel more bathed in light. And then his underside, the bottom part of his neck, his chest, that arm in shadow, the underside of his tail. I'm kind of starting to think like team light and team dark. I'm trying to move things to one side or the other so that all of these little micro form renderings that I've been doing start to read at a glance more like shapes. In fact, if you squint at this a little bit now, hopefully you can kind of see that highlight shape and that shadow shape. Now, obviously there's a million shades of gray between those two, but I want to kind of define it in those terms pretty distinctly. Which side is in the light? Which side is in the shadow? That makes it an easier read. This is a part of the process that trips up a lot of artists, in my experience as a teacher. When you have been defining shapes, when you've learned your value edge control really well, and you've been defining every little muscle and tendon and wrinkle, but somehow it doesn't look as real as you wanted. You keep adding detail, but like, why is this looking just chaotic and it doesn't read like I want it to? It's usually because of that. It's usually because we've gotten a little bit lost in the pixels. We are rendering microforms, but we've sort of forgotten about the macro forms, the big picture stuff, where the top of the cylinder is in the light, the bottom of the cylinder is in the dark, maybe even has a little bit of bounced reflected light. All of those things really help to make these really read as real, as three-dimensional forms with all of that cool anatomical stuff built in, but also just something the eye can digest. Oftentimes, this is where less is more really becomes a truism. Now, this is a pretty complex rendering up to this point, definitely. Muscles, shapes, different textures, like some scaly stuff versus some wrinkly skin. There's a lot going on here. So we need to kind of simplify it in that way. Otherwise, it just becomes too much. It's sort of a lesson that I learned from trying to find a great way to paint foliage on trees. And I tried everything for that. I tried brushes that spray out individual leaves. I tried all kinds of Photoshop tricks with a mixer brush, but I always arrived at the same problem where it just looked so noisy and chaotic that I kind of hated it. It just, even though I look at a tree outside my window and I see thousands of individual leaves, if I try to actually paint like that, it looks terrible. It just looks noisy and fizzy and not good. So the answer ended up being to simplify, to kind of paint foliage as cloudy shapes, clumps of leaves, more of an impression instead of each individual unit. It's really powerful. That lesson carries over to things like this too, kind of separating things into those zones of light and dark a little bit. We don't want to lose all of that detail entirely. We want to hint at it with shadow shapes like we've got going on with those scales on the neck. Really powerful stuff when we can use shapes to do that heavy lifting instead of exhaustive rendering. It just becomes very powerful. Now, I've been doing some more color work, and this is where I'm going to be kind of all over the map because I changed my decision like 5 times on this. What color do I want this dragon to be? Playing around with kind of a gold yellow at this point, which is kind of cool, but just as a spoiler, I do end up changing that, as you probably noticed on the thumbnail. I do this with adjustment layers, or I guess multiply layers, overlay layers, basically command clicking on the silhouette of the layer that I'm working on. So if you click on that layer thumbnail, it makes a selection, and then I'll just fill in a color on a new layer and set that to multiply or overlay, something to either darken it, create an accent color, give it a little glow of warmer light, or just to kind of assign a new local color. So to turn the dragon from being that pale off-white to yellow, I basically did exactly that. I just filled in the silhouette, gave it a yellow multiply layer, and instantly the dragon is now yellow and a little darker. So I'm tinkering with that stuff, trying to see what kind of iconic color I want to assign to this dragon. Another great thing about dragons is since they are not real, you are totally free with this. You can make this dragon neon pink. You can make it onyx black. Anything you want, nobody can say that's inaccurate because they're a fantasy creature. So another great thing that makes dragons just the ultimate playground and teaching tool for concept artists is you can apply a lot of really powerful design principles, but you're sort of limited by very little in a lot of ways. You can go pretty nuts with the way the dragon's body is configured. There are dragons with, arms that are separate from their wings. You can have a dragon with some crazy long neck. There's plenty of room for variation and experimentation while still working within this basic framework of, dinosaur-ish flying monster type of thing. I've added another multiply layer. I'm experimenting with an accent color. Let's say like I wanted his back to be darker than his underbelly. That's a great way to do that. Multiply layers are kind of like you can give him a paint job. We could go bolder than that. If I wanted him to have red spots or something, I would do it in the same way. It's really cool, really powerful, and it's a great way to, it feels like you're painting a model car or something. This is when you do the paint job. Give him some flair, some cool surface details. I keep it pretty restrained, pretty monochromatic, but again, you're limited by absolutely nothing with this kind of a design in painting. Really cool. Doing a bit of value anchoring too. Here's another, I have so much to say about value, and dragons really exemplify it, but I like to try to control my value range rather than letting it be really wildly stretched from black to white. I like to keep it in a pretty narrow range for the most part. So most of the highlight side of this dragon is, just 1 or 2 value range numbers apart. What that frees us up to do is add some really dark accents. So it makes those little lines underneath the scales on the top of his neck look like ambient occlusion. It looks really realistic. It makes the dark around his eyes, or those dark scale lines crossing his neck, look very realistic. Just because we've set it up, we've been restrained, and then that lets us do these things to add pop. Really powerful and cool. It also lets us use the midtone. Hugely powerful. So when we can set up a value painting in this way, where we have a light side that is a very visible shape next to a dark side, that gives us a midtone, this single spot where light and shadow collide. And that's a really important zone in a painting, because we can have little incursions across that border. We can have bits of dark cross into the light, like we have with those scale lines. We can have bits of light cross back into the dark. And sometimes both kind of work well together. Super cool. Now, I have done that in several places on this, and it lets shapes do the heavy lifting. Instead of trying to paint a bunch of scales along that dragon's neck, I basically have communicated all of that texture just with a couple of shapes, a couple of little lines that have been dragged from one side to the other. It's really powerful, and again, whenever you can just let a shape do it for you instead of really getting into that 1 pixel brush detail, it just makes things read better. It makes it easier for your viewer to digest. They will just get it at a glance instead of having to squint and lean in, because after years of rendering really exhaustive detail, thinking that the more detail I add would be better, this is really the conclusion that I came to. This is what really started working, is when I let all of that go, when I stopped trying to detail things to death. It all just started working better, and shapes were the way out on that. Hope that's helpful. That was a no man's land that I struggled in for years. So really powerful stuff, and a great way to make something hard into something that's deceptively simple. Guys, this is sort of the format that I usually do for my project kits. I have several of these for sale in the shop section at Digital Painting Studio. They're great as little one-off kits if you want to just explore a certain technique. Have one on characters, have machines, have environments, and we're adding new ones all the time. So this dragon painting is sort of, I wanted to do a creature as well. I was creating it as a new project kit, but I thought it would be cool to just put it out on YouTube as a freebie. But if you're enjoying this, check those out, because we've got pretty much one of everything at the DPS shop. Anyway, back to Dragonland. Tinkering with the color a little bit and just trying to arrive at something that I really like. Trying out some accent colors, trying out some different color variations. I'm a little indecisive at this point because there just are no bad options. Pretty much any color in the entire spectrum is going to look cool for this. So I'm struggling with just which one do I like more. When you feel like you're at these impasses, that's usually a good time for a break. Let it sit overnight. Go for a walk. Go eat lunch. Go kind of unplug for a little while. And when you come back with fresh eyes, often the solution is clear. That didn't especially work for me this time. I had to just tinker and eventually just decide on one way or another. And I ended up going with cyan. It sort of matches the dragon that I did in that other video, which I like, and it just looks cool. Can't go wrong. One of my favorite colors, something I use in a lot of things. I'm kind of addicted to cyan. Now, I'm doing a luster pass. Not strictly necessary, but these, when used with a lot of restraint, add a nice little bit of pop. Actually, they can be very descriptive about the surface detail. How shiny is this material? Is this dragon kind of like amphibian? Is it like frog skin? Is it scaly and hard? Is that like a bony shell? There can be a lot of information in these highlights. What I love to do is paint them and then kind of scratch little lines through them with the eraser tool. Makes it look like it's kind of like a car that got keyed, that clear coat had a little scratch through it. And it's just a lot of information. It tells us about the forms, but also the texture, the reflectivity, tells us a lot about what kind of skin is this. It also just helps us bring attention, right? So those more eye-catching parts. Is there a particular bit of muscle rendering that's just especially awesome? Like I really like the way the shoulders and that elbow crease. I love the muscles of the neck, that curve that they make. So I just wanted to put a little extra something there to give it some zing, right? Bring a little more attention to that. And I find that really cool. We're getting pretty close, guys. We're kind of getting into the polish steps, which are another place I can kind of end up lost in the wilderness. So I have to kind of manage myself a lot on this. Like give myself, okay, we're just going to spend the rest of this afternoon on this and then we're done. Or I let it sit overnight and then I come back and I noodle things one more sitting and then it's done. Otherwise, you get into that tricky zone of nothing's ever finished, right? As an artist, it's like, is this thing done? Could I have made it better? These questions can just haunt you. So I like to just really put the governor on myself and just set boundaries in that way. We've still got some things to do, like rendering the rock, for example. I like to do rocks very impressionistically and simply. I have another brush in the DPS Brush Pack, which is in our freebies section on Discord. I'll put a link for that if anybody wants to grab these. And there's absolutely no agenda there. I just sincerely want everybody to have these if they want them. So jump into Discord, grab them, and leave the server if you're not liking it. If you are, that's awesome. It's actually incredibly cool. We have a really supportive and outstanding community that we have grown. But this is not at all like we're not trying to sell you anything. So grab those brushes and I hope you enjoy them. But just defining, like, again, a light side and a dark side, kind of, rather than getting lost in the weeds on detail. Just trying to define these things simply and with as few shapes, as few fussiness and bits of noise as I possibly can. I find that is usually a recipe for success, when we can let something be an impression. When we can let your viewer's imagination connect some dots instead of just showing things, kind of forcing it down their throat. Leave a little space for them to kind of complete things. Let their imagination take over. It does this really magical thing where it invites them in. They take ownership a little bit. They're a participant in this story that you're telling rather than just you yelling it at them. Really magical, and one of those higher level things that I just really was not thinking about earlier in my journey as an artist, but that changed everything. And it also just makes things way easier. We don't have to render things to death for them to just get the message across. In fact, it literally works much better when you don't. restraint is the key, I think, and that's a hard thing to do. It's hard to do less is more. It's hard to kind of know that the way is not always more, but just knowing where to use things in a targeted way. That has been the hardest trick for me to learn. So hopefully you can, take a shortcut on that and get to that better result faster than I did just by hearing this. That's definitely my hope. Just sort of polishing things, treating edges. That is sort of a trick in digital painting, is things can be so perfect, right? You can control stuff to the pixel. When that happens, it can be great, but it can also lead you to this look that's kind of sterile and lifeless, right? Pixelated edges around the outside of a shape kind of kill that sense of roundness. So I like to smudge, treat those edges, make them look a little bit more loose and brushy, and it helps that effect. It actually it lets your viewer in a little bit more. It kind of turns it into more of an impression. Even at these late steps, you just saw me kind of liquefy the shape of the head. His jaw was looking really square and bone crusher-like, so I wanted to sharpen the face a little bit more. I'm making design changes even in the 11th hour here. So again, digital art is so great for this because everything is editable. Every mistake is forgiven. You are never really committed to a path. You can always backtrack and try different things. But that's about it, guys. There are some polish steps that I'm going to be making, just little last minute additions and bits of noodling to try and make this as cool as possible. In fact, as a final teachable lesson for this, I would call that the push. That kind of last thing. When you feel like a painting is done, leave it alone for a full day, if you can, if you don't have a deadline or anything like that. And come back at it and look at it with fresh eyes. If it still looks done to you, if you think you've done it, awesome. Post it or send it along. But I find that almost every time I do this, there is something that I would like to tinker with, or I see an opportunity to add things, these little extra rhythmic scales kind of bumping down the neck, little bits of detail, maybe some scars and scrapes on the dragon's face. There's always some little thing that I think would add something. So it's really tempting, right? When we finish something, I know I like to, if it's for my portfolio, I want to post it immediately. I want to get them likes, y'all. I want to hear what people think. I want to show my work to the world. I want that payoff. And that's okay. We all want that. As artists, it's not wrong to want that. But every time I post something immediately after the painting finished, I always see something when it's in ArtStation. I'm like, I wish I had waited on that. That happens with client work too. Sometimes I'm really excited to get a client's perspective on something, but it just, there was something I wish I had changed. That's about it for this one, guys. Hope you enjoyed this. Hope you learned a few things. Dragons have so much cool stuff to teach us about design and painting. Again, if you enjoyed this, be sure to check out the project kits on DPS. In the meantime, have a great rest of your summer. Paint something cool today.